Why you, the new me? You dreamt of a near collision in a parking lot. Your fault, it seemed, but no one hurt. Nothing really to get upset about. But when you slowly apologetically edge round in your vehicle with a view to leaving, you see you have to deal with the attendants, who might be bouncers at a nightclub or police at a demo, or simply an innocuous version of people who, like Don DeLillo, have started out their adult lives as parking attendants, except that these attendants, of whom there are at least 4, are unusually lofty, like the tall Venusians in David Bowie's Memory of a Free Festival, and they have mirrors for bodies. Their heads are cubes with a separate reflective surface on every side. You are not well when you wake up. You weren't well when you went to sleep. And you think of the epitaph inscribed on the comedian Spike Milligan's gravestone in St. Thomas's churchyard in Winchelsea in East Sussex. I told you I was ill. It's like that. And when you tell the love of your life about the dream, she says it sounds like the opening of Invisible Man. Like the bodiless heads you see sometimes in circus sideshows, it is as though I have been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. When they approach me, people see only my surroundings, themselves or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me. What you want to talk about is the like, simile, and similarity, analogy, the tropical fairground of resemblance. The resemblance to bouncers or policemen, tall Venusians, Don DeLillo, Spike Milligan, Ralph Ellison's As Though, perhaps even a new mirror stage, distinct from any Lacanian model. But stage makes it sound unduly solid, located or locatable. You look around for a way of talking about this. It's the story of your life. It wasn't about me. In this you were, avant la lettre, in accord with Timothy Bew's Free Indirect, the novel in a post-fictional age, which argues for a conception of the novel as bringing into being, inventing, a thought that cannot be inhabited subjectively. Bewes observes, the question of the novel's thought cannot be addressed successfully in a critical discourse that presumes a unity of the speaking subject, a corresponding unity of the spoken utterance, and the fact of the work as a translation or transformation of thoughts or events that pre-exist it as its ultimate point of reference. It is a matter of acknowledging that, as he puts it, the novel exceeds its form, exceeds, that is, the structure that has organized almost all professional literary criticism since the novel's inception, and of elaborating a thinking of what he calls the free indirect, which is to be understood, he says, not as a style or discourse, but as a non-anchored, non-centered perspective. This was a focus of your first book, Telepathy in Literature, 1990, which began with the proposition that it is difficult to imagine a theory of fiction, a theory of the novel, without a theory of telepathy. Starting perhaps from the hypothesis that fiction is, in some radical sense, incapable of non-telepathic representation, starting from the thought that the telepathic founds the very possibility of character, characterization, etc. He thought, she felt, they believed. No psychological realism, you argued, without telepathy. This was the unanchored, veering concern of your work for decades. Most lately in the book Ellen Sixu, Dreamer, Realist, Analyst, Writing. There is no realism, no free indirect discourse, no third person or omniscient narration without telepathy. and in the essay Protective Mimicry, Reflections on the Novel Today, where you argued for a notion of telepathy in contradistinction to the tacitly humanistic, individualizing notion of free indirect discourse, which is never simply free or indirect or discourse. What you call telepathy, on the contrary, exceeds, moves off, keeps sharing and joining up elsewhere. It is not limited to an anthropocentric domain of one human individual and another, or even to what is living or dead. It was a matter from the beginning of attending to the radicality of telepathy as what, in the words of Claudette Sartilio, breaches the discreteness and unity of the subject, as well as the systems of thought derived from it. Really, it was enough to drive you crazy. You started talking to yourself. On more than one occasion, you could be witnessed doing this in public at length. Of course, there had been early signs. You claimed that telepathy in literature was about dissolving the and in its title. The book constituted an involvement with literature along the lines of Michel Foucault's desire in Madness and Civilization. You wanted to explore the archaeology of a silence, to consider literature as a discursive formation, to write in madness. That's what you were apparently getting at in the chapter called Letter on Poetry, when you concluded, "You won't come. This will never have reached you, my love. It's not you, it's the stranger. Always the stranger, in the trances of the blast, silent as icicles, quiet as the moon." Sorry. In The Uncanny, in 2003, you tried to evoke the thing in dramatic form, in a sort of nano-drama, far and away the shortest chapter in the book. It was titled Silence, Solitude, and a Case of Aposiopesis, in other words, in which you cited, without citation marks, Freud's phrase in his essay on the uncanny, silence, solitude, and death. The entire chapter occupied just 4 lines. Did you say something? I heard a voice. In your head? No, in yours. And certainly your interests in the you were evident in more self-remarkingly fictional publications, from the quick fiction called The Slide in 2007 to the second-person narrative elements of Quilt in 2010 and An English Guide to Birdwatching in 2017. But mostly you managed to keep it buttoned up, this publicly talking aloud to yourself. It became less easy to ignore, however, with the literary turn, a lecture given at a conference on writing in a post-Derridian era at the University of Växjö in Sweden in October 2008. The lecture began with the words, "You are not there," and a critical disclaiming of the fashion for all sorts of turns. So many turns, you sigh, the linguistic turn, the political, the ethical, and so on, etc., enough to make you turn in your grave. Prematurely, you think, no need for another, especially not a literary turn, you have to be joking. The literary turn was never going to make much of a splash. That seemed obvious. You were inclined to consider it strictly for the birds. Indeed, it was one of the impulses for writing An English Guide to Birdwatching, a book which was published in 2017 as a novel, but was for you rather an attempt at writing for the birds, birds dead and alive everywhere in the world and in the word. Birdwatching and word-botching, an apish or apian paean to the beauty of birds and birdsong, a murmuration of flights into ornithomorphism and ornithophony, a book-length elegy for historic and ongoing human atrocities of bird torture, bird killing, and mass species extinctions. You proposed literary turn as a phrase to double business bound, like Jonathan Culler's The Literary in Theory. The literary turn entails reckoning with the porosity and interweavings of literature and theory, and is driven by the thought of what Jacques Derrida calls a poetico-literary performativity, at least analogous to that of promises, orders, or acts of constitution or legislation, which do not only change language, or which, in changing language, change more than language. You still believe, though of course you stand to be corrected, that this literary turn in 2008 was the first example of public academic discourse delivered entirely in the second person. You didn't know it at the time, but 2 years previously, in 2006, Brian Richardson had published his richly interesting study, Unnatural Voices, Extreme Narration in Modern and Contemporary Fiction, in which he observes, "It is easy to see why narrative theory has resisted conceptualizing second-person fiction for so long. There is, of course, the force of habit, especially the habit of thinking in terms of binary oppositions. For those theorists attempting to construct a universal narratology capable of embracing all narratives, both factual and fictional, an additional problem appears. First and third-person novels have obvious non-fictional counterparts in autobiography and biography, but second-person narrative is an exclusively and distinctly literary phenomenon, its only non-fictional analogues being the pseudo-narrative forms of the cookbook, the travel guide, and the self-help manual." End of quote. Without your having intended to do so, the literary turn displaced, if not overturned, Richardson's contention that second-person narrative is an exclusively and distinctly literary phenomenon. You'd come up with an at least arguably non-fictional counterpart in the field of critical writing. But then, like Bartleby, you'd prefer not to leave it like that, as if you were some sort of finely rational figuration of the critic or the theorist, or correspondingly as if the narrator of Harry Matthews' sublime recipe, Country Cooking, or the narrator of Laurie Moore's urbane self-help texts were not crazy and fantastical. Rather, as the literary turn emphasized, you are such a wayward creature, one never knows if you are alive or dead, or whether one ever hears your voice, whether it is you or the effect of some other ventriloquy. One doesn't know who makes you up. Same difference, you say. You have no name. You turn, you veer, you call. Richardson's study nonetheless helped to inspire another second-person text, even the title, On the State of Narrative Theory Today, published in the journal Narrative in 2014. You admired Richardson's responsiveness to the sense of intimate unfamiliarity, as he calls it, that you, not you, darling, but the use or irremediably other yous of you made possible, though you also wanted to query Richardson's rather formless tone and manner, including his at moments too easy reliance on the natural and unnatural. You went back, as of yore, no pun intended, to the uncanny, and one of the starting points for the book of that title, namely thinking of the uncanny as a crisis of the natural. Why you? In whose voice do you hear this question? There is no natural voice in a literary or critical text. So you made what you are now tempted to call a critical U-turn. A U-turn away, off to the side, counter to, or at least at odds with, what would come to be called the subjective turn. The U-turn was an aspect of your passion for a writing wary of the me machine, and at the same time committed to invention, chance, and the unforeseeable, other voices, pathways, and perspectives. You saw the rise of creative writing as a kind of reaction formation, colluding with the late capitalist snapshot capture of the individual, the student as customer, the machinery of college courses and degrees, the publishing industry, and so on. Enabled by the very radicality of the deconstructive thinking, it also made it its business to resist. You knew that the phrase linguistic turn was both ridiculous and inept for characterizing Jacques Derrida's work, but you also came to sense that something sad had happened back there, in terms of what people awkwardly called the reception of deconstruction, and you coined the word lingophobia as a way of trying to encapsulate this, the fact of living in what Garrett Stewart calls an age of atrophied verbal instincts. It's not that you simply gave up on me. You even wrote an essay called Me. Admittedly, it was a co-authored text, part of the Introduction to Literature, Criticism and Theory. As you say, as you and Andrew Bennett say in Me, in undecidable unison, who is to say that there is an I anywhere that is not in some sense literary? You have been working on Me, on and off, for more than 30 years. With each new edition of the book, you try to ensure that it's as up-to-date and clear and engaging as possible, starting out from an acknowledgement that the me is, in Margaret Atwood's words, stuck with words, stuck in them. You see me in terms of a continuing deconstruction of anthropocentrism. In the most recent 6th edition, 2023, you give new emphasis to ecological crisis as me crisis, recalling the point of departure of Timothy Morton's book Humankind from 2017. Am I simply a vehicle for the bacteria that inhabit my microbiome? Or are they hosting me? Who is the host and who is the parasite? And you give new emphasis also to the machine and the prosthetic, drawing on the work of David Wills and citing Carey Wolf's recent book, Ecological Poetics, or Wallace Stevens' Birds. Integral to the I is a machine-like dimension of enunciation that is radically not the I, and indeed that is radically ahuman, non-living. You don't like the phrase subjective turn, or autofiction, or auto-theory, or critical fabulation, or creative nonfiction. Actually, they make your flesh creep. They all seem in different ways misleading, complacent, trapping. Nor do you like reality literature, though here you have to draw a line and accept some responsibility because you made it up. Reality literature is a neologism you initially ventured in the afterword to Quilt in 2010 and have invoked occasionally since. It emerged out of the experience of writing about the death of your father and the world of marine rays, especially stingrays and manta rays. The quilt of the book title is not primarily a layered coverlet, you had to tell people, but an 18th century synonym for a manta ray. Reality literature is not a genre, but something more ghostly and fleeting. Its vivacity is spectral. You say it is about meddling, making trouble in and with language, resisting and, as far as possible, interfering with what you call the smoothly neutralizing, nulling flow of the program. You acknowledge with nary a shrug that reality literature has not entered into common parlance, like its televisual counterpart. You've been talking to yourself again, and you suspect it's probably time to put a sock in it. You will avoid a digression on the sock, a drifting off to ruminate on footwear, beginning with Ellen Sixou's observation that writing is about getting ready, assembling yourself, including every article of clothing, starting with your socks. Instead, you want to turn to an author who is also, as it happens, very interested in the relationship between clothes and writing, namely Lisa Robertson, someone best known as a poet and essayist, but it's her novel you want to talk about, the Baudelaire Fractal from 2020. This is a first-person narrative related by a woman called Hazel Brown. Hazel Brown has told you this right at the start, and then there's a new section called The Port, which begins as follows. I awake in a hotel room. I hear gulls, the clinking and rocking of boats. I turn in the wide bed. The tightness and stiffness of the sheets feels pleasantly confining. In the first stirrings of thinking, I discover within myself a strangeness, not a dislocation or a dissociation, but a freshening shimmer of sensual clarity, shot through with strands of unmoored refusal and scorn. Beneath that, a slowly vibrating warp of erotic sadness. I abandon myself to this novel sensation. I open my eyes. Reader, I become him. Was that what I felt? No, I did not become him. I became what he wrote. Do you sometimes at earliest waking observe yourself struggling towards a pronoun? Do you fleetingly, as if from a great distance, strain to recall who it is that breathes and turns? Do you ever wish to quit the daily comedy of transforming into the I speaker without abandoning the wilderness of sensing? The sensation isn't morbid, it is ultimately disinterested. For me, it's a familiar moment, boring and persistent and disappointing. Again, one arrives at the threshold of this particular straightening I. With a tiny, wincing flourish, one enters the wearisome contract, sets foot to planks. Daily, the humiliation is almost forgotten, until it blooms again with the next waking. It is an embarrassing perception best stoically flicked aside, left unreported. With an obscure hesitation, one steps into the day and its frame and its costume. Now you sense that there is a lot to say about Robertson's book. Its inventive, strange, and richly textured prose. Its imaginative, compelling, funny account of being a Canadian student who fetches up in France in the 1980s and makes her life there. It's a novel about a love of clothes and boys and Paris. It's about how the narrator gets really into Deleuze and Kristeva and what she calls the world-changing texts of Judith Butler. But above all, it's about Baudelaire, his life and poetry, and the fact that, as Hazel Brown puts it, I simply discovered within myself, late one morning in middle age, the authorship of all Baudelaire's work. There are many correspondences between the life of Hazel Brown and the life of Lisa Robertson, and you couldn't help wondering as you were reading quite why there should be the act of naming a narrator at all. You wondered if an anonymous speaker wouldn't have been more haunting and affecting, more in the spirit perhaps of Catherine Scanlon or indeed Baudelaire. But for the moment, for now, your concern is with how with what Hazel Brown calls the hot nib of my pronoun, figures in this passage you've just read out. It's a beguiling, probing evocation of the hypnagogic shifting and drifting into consciousness after sleep. You note that it is also presented as a turn. I turn in the wide bed. The narrator goes on to speak of straining to recall who it is that breathes and turns. The passage sketches a sort of embodiment of a subjective turn, arriving at the threshold of this particular straightening I. The straightening is nicely not straight. Besides the ironic homophone, straightening, the word suggests distressing, putting into difficulties, but also, quite differently, confining. In this state or strait of in-betweenness, Hazel speaks or thinks in the second person. Do you sometimes, At earliest waking, observe yourself struggling towards a pronoun. Do you ever wish to quit the daily comedy of transforming into the I speaker without abandoning the wilderness of sensing? You like this, you. It's what you're all about. You can relate very easily to struggling towards a pronoun and to the idea of a daily comedy of transforming into the I speaker. It's the comedy, after all, of Kafka's great metamorphosis. You enjoy the twisted Jane Eyre formulation, "Reader, I became him," but at the same time something in you resists. You want to hold on to the dream, to expatiate on the wilderness of sensing that Hazel Brown intimates. You're thinking about what Maurice Blanchot says in Dreaming Writing, his foreword to Michel Leiris' Nights as Days, Days as Night, 1961. Dreaming writing is integral to what you've been calling the U-turn. It allows you to revisit Freud's The Uncanny afresh, to see how much the uncanny is not about identity, especially not about the me or I as something fixed or become, reader, I became him, but rather about resemblance. Blanchot is concerned with a literary affirmation that is not psychoanalytic or autobiographical, with a kinship between writing and dreaming and what he describes as the similar though eccentric being that was us during the night. He writes, "Resemblances abound in dreams, for each person that you dream about tends to be extremely, marvelously resemblant. This is even their only identity. They resemble. They belong to that region in which pure resemblance shines forth, a resemblance that is sometimes certain and fixed, at other times always certain but unstable and wandering, though fascinating and stirring every time. Consider the powerful spell a chance passer-by can cast on us if, for a split second, he bears a resemblance. How we are drawn to his face, how it haunts us, familiar and remote. It also frightens us a bit. We are in a hurry to identify it, that is, to erase it by redirecting it to the circle of things in which actual human beings are so bound up with themselves that they are without resemblance." In conclusion, you want to suggest that that's what is enabling about you. The written I can never be the writing I, as Proust understood. A book is a product of another self. You know that. It's your very raison d'etre. But what you also brings into focus is something like the uncanny truth, the fact or factuality, as you would be so bold as to call it, of resemblance, the inexhaustible play of resemblances that is mobilized by the second person and by the U-turn. What are you like? That is the question. In the silence, you don't know. You can't go on. You'll go on.